Good afternoon, class, and today we'll be looking at forensic entomology. Now, what is forensic entomology? Now, this branch of science, it basically deals with the application of insects that are associated with criminal investigations. Now, these insects, they are usually found on a vertebrate corpse that is decomposing. For example, a human body. Now, evidence of these insects, they have the ability to tell a lot about the body. For example, determination of time of death, the site of trauma. They could also give an estimated geographical location of the death. They could aid in DNA samples and alternative toxicology samples. And lastly, they could also create a link between the victim and the suspect. Now, even though the main purpose of forensic entomology is to investigate deaths, it also has secondary purposes. For example, in cases of food infestation, when procedures of pest management are not properly followed, they could create an ideal environment for some insects. And this, it could lead to cross-contamination of various food products with insect debris or even the food itself. You know, sometimes if you go and you buy a nice Chinese food and while you eating this food, you find out, no, you find like a roach leg or sometimes even a whole roach in this food. Well, yes, this is one example of such case. And I know it happened to some of y'all already, so don't even lie. Anyways, now in situations like these, forensic entomologists are needed to investigate and to create to help in legal support actually, because sometimes you never know if the person that find this roach or something they gonna want to sue the people and carry them to court and all of that. So this is why forensic entomologists are also needed. Now, moving on. How long has this type of science been used? Now, forensic entomology, it has first been used during the 13th century. My bad, I think I spelled the word wrong. But anyways, it was used in the 13th century, and this was because in in um in the 13th century in ancient China, there was a local farmer, right? And he was murdered and he was basically found hacked to death. Now, during this time period, forensic entomology, it was still in its developmental stage. And all that investigators or detectives had during this time was just like a basic understanding of the science. Now, due to this, investigators used an animal carcass and they inflicted wounds using multiple weapons. Because remember that they didn't know how this man died, right? So they they used the carcass and they inflicted multiple wounds on it, and they compared the wound with the one present on the farmer, and they basically concluded that it was caused by a sickle. Excuse me. Now, suspected persons, they were ordered by the local magistrate to put their sickle on the ground, and as it lay there, the blowflies, they began gathering over the area, and they began swarming over one particular sickle, and this was enough evidence to point out who the killer was. Now, how this works, right, is that the blowflies, they are naturally attracted to blood and soft tissues and the bones of dead bodies and so on, right? So this is one example of how forensic entomology was used for the very first time in the history of forensic science, and it allowed justice to be served. Now, as the years progressed, obviously this science it developed, and in the 18th century, the first ever application of forensic entomology was used in a modern courthouse in France, right? This entomological data was accepted and it was used as evidence to exonerate occupants of the residence. Now, in this residence, they found the skeletal remains of a child. So they basically used the entomological data to help free these people, right? Now, moving on. How are these insects used in criminal investigations? Now, firstly, we have the postmortem changes and the entomological association of these insects, right? Now, when a person dies, autolysis occurs, and autolysis is a process in which the cells die and the enzymes within the body they basically begin to digest these cells inside out, right? Now, after this process occurs, the body it becomes sorry, the body it starts to decompose. Now, insects are attracted to the compounds which are emitted from the body during decomposition, right? These compounds are produced when the bacteria that is found in our digestive tract breaks down soft tissues, and during this process, gases and liquids such as carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and so on are produced. Now, there are four different categories of insects that can be found on the decomposing body. These are the necrophagous species, and they include beetles, wasps, the blowflies, and so on. The second category is the predators and parasites, which feed on the necrophagous species. Now, under this second category, there is also another subgroup called it, alright, I can't pronounce this word properly, but they're called the schizophagous species, right? They feed on the body and they eventually become predatory, right? Now, the third category consists of omnivorous species, and they feed on other insects such as the ants, some beetles, the wasps, etc. And the last category consists of species such as the springtails and other insects that basically use the corpse as their home. Now, however, right, even though we have all these insects on the body, there are two main order of insects that are of major forensic importance. These are the Diptera, or the true flies, and the beetles. Now, these two insect groups they are well known for their frequent presence on decaying bodies. So this takes us to the blowflies, right? Or the Diptera. Now, the importance of blowflies in forensics. Now, in forensic entomology, there are basically two ways in which the time of death of a body could be determined using insects. The first method it basically deals with the maggots of the true flies. Now, in order for the time of death to be determined, the insect of this order, which is again the blowfly, it must undergo its life cycle. Now, these blowflies, they are usually the very first set of insects that is present on the corpse soon after death, right? So, when they arrive, they would lay their eggs in the wounds of the corpse if any is present. And if there's no wound present, they will usually lay their eggs in any natural opening on the body, such as the mouth, the nose, the ears, the eyes, and so on. And if exposed, the anus and the other genitals, right? So the reason why they do not lay their eggs directly on the body is due to the adult blowflies having soft mouth parts that are tongue-like. So they do not have the ability to pierce through human skin. However, the natural body openings, they serve as an ideal environment for the eggs as they are moist and humid, and this enhances the hatching of eggs and survival of the larvae. Now, the development of the larvae can give investigators the date of the death and is usually used during the first few weeks after death. Now, the development of this insect, it has a standard cycle. The eggs are laid in clumps and they hatch after a period of time into the first instar larva. This larva, it uses the corpse as a food source until it molds into its second stage, which is the second instar larva. Now, this larva, it does the same as the larva in the fourth stage. It basically uses the corpse as food until it develops into the third instar larva. Alright, first of all, let me just apologize for the noise in the background. It's the neighbors is sporting because it's holiday time. So anyways, moving on to the where was I? Yeah, the second oh yeah, it develops into the third instar larva, and this stage it is recognized by the number of spiracles that is present and also its size, right? So when this stage is reached, it still uses the corpse as a food source, but after a period of time, it ceases the feeding and it usually migrates from the corpse to areas such as the soil, the fabric, and like other places around the body where it is deemed safe to pupate. Now, this other stage is known as the pre-pupa, right? So during this stage, the pupa undergoes metamorphosis, and I ain't gonna tell you how is metamorphosis. We do this since primary school, so yeah, I should know this. And anyways, it develops into an adult, and after a set number of days, the adult will like fully emerge, and the cycle will repeat. Now, after this happens, right, an empty pupil case is left as a form of evidence after the adult emerges. And these stages they serve as crucial clues to investigators. As each stage of development, they have a specific time frame that is known. Now, this time frame it is in accordance to the amount of food present and the temperature range. Due to insects being cold-blooded now, the temperature plays an important role in their development. For example, when there's an increase in temperature, their metabolic rate it is increased, and this leads to faster development. And while the opposite occurs with lower temperatures, so it's vice versa. Now, investigators they would use this to their advantage because with this now they're able to analyze the oldest stage of the insect, which is found on the corpse, and the temperature of the area in which the corpse is found. Now, this would give a hint as to when the first set of insects deposited their eggs on the body, and this would then lead investigators to determine like a day or a time frame in which death occurred. One example would be like if the insect found on the body, like if the insect is 7 days old, this means that the person has been dead for approximately 7 days. However, this method is only applicable until the first set of adults emerge. After this occurs, like the investigators, they cannot determine which generation is there. So in a nutshell, like after the life cycle of one blowfly is completed, the time of the death it could be determined. Moving on, sorry. Moving on to insects, to beetles and other insects that is present on the body. Now, since the blowflies are the first to invade the body after death, other insects follow to colonize the corpse. For example, the beetles. There are a wide variety of beetles present, such as the dermestid beetle, the carrion beetles, the clown beetles, sap beetles, etc. Now, these different beetles are found in different parts of the corpse. For example, the dermestid beetle, they arrive after the soft tissues of the corpse has been eaten by other organisms. They usually thrive on like the hair and the skin of the body, right? Now, the adult carrion beetles, they would thrive on the maggots found on the body, and the clown beetles, they are somehow smart, you could say, as they hide under the corpse during the day and they only come out in the night to feed on the maggots that are present or the larvae of the dermestid beetle. Now, in addition to this, there's also like different types of flies that is present on the corpse other than the blowflies. These include the house flies, fruit flies, coffin flies, etc. and they would usually feed off the remaining tissues of the body. Now, as time progresses, right, the dead body it becomes like a support for a wide variety of insects, which ranges from many species, and this gives rise to like thousands of individuals. Now, I have a picture. Well, all right, leave it for later. Now, however, whilst there are so many insects present, the larvae of the blowfly they still colonize the remains. So they're like they're always around her, and they're seen like crawling and just scurrying around the corpse and in the soil and just around the body. Now, all of these insects they are drawn to the body in a sequence and a progressive way. So all of these insects won't come at this body one time. Now, due to this, forensic entomologists they are able to grasp important information, which would allow them to analyze the circumstances that surrounds the death of the individual, as long as there is a sample present to represent each insect on the body, or around the body, or under the body. But anyways, moving on to the okay, so I left out this part on this PowerPoint, but you guys will see it in the document that I sent. Now, the insects, the larvae, it could also be used to estimate the postmortem index, right? Now, the postmortem index, it is basically the time between a death and finding the body. Now, the larvae of the insect, right? It is found on the corpse and it could provide investigators with evidence for the postmortem index for approximately 1 month. Forensic entomologists, they first need to identify the correct species because different insect species they differ in growth and maturation rates and all of that. Now, in order to estimate the postmortem index, the age of the larva it must be determined, and this is done by measuring its length or dry weight, and then doing a comparison with reference data. And this is how they determine the age, basically. Now, temperature also plays an important role in the development of the larvae. This was mentioned before, right? Now, as each developmental stage requires a different temperature, and this leads to each species having their own specific number of collected. Sorry about that. Yeah, this leads to each species having their own specific number of collected degree days or hours, which is needed to complete their development. Now, after investigators obtain the thermal history of the larvae, they compare this to the temperatures found at the crime scene and hence the postmortem index it is estimated. Now, in addition to this, the first set of flies that is present on the corpse, it could also be used to determine age. And they are usually identified by features such as their small abdomen and the gray, like dull color, and wings that are usually shriveled up, right? Now, the next one we will look at is entomotoxicology, and this is a branch of forensic entomology which deals with the detection of toxins and like drugs from developmental insects found on the human corpse. So the main concept of this era is you are what you eat, right? So this also goes with insects which feed on the dead body. Now, if the flesh is contaminated with different types of drugs, then it will be consumed by the insect, obviously, and hence this would interfere with their metabolism and their survival. Because if the person that died, right, if they were in like heroin or cocaine or someone in fancy drugs, though, now if they die because like an overdose and the insects start like feeding off their body, obviously the drugs can go into the insect system also, right? And they can mess with metabolism and all that. It could probably kill them too. So, in addition to this, right, if the body is highly decomposed or skeletonized or even moved, the carrion insects present, they could also provide important toxicological information to the investigators. Now, if the diseased they had ingested like a poison or something, the larva of the flies, it will absorb the toxins as they feed, like I mentioned before. When investigators examine now the sample of these insects collected from the crime scene, the circumstances surrounding the death, it could be determined. For example, if the death occurred under the influence of drugs, the cause of death could be determined. Now, when bodies are highly decomposed or skeletonized, it is difficult to detect toxic substances. Now, hence, various techniques are used to examine insects that are present during these stages. For example, fetal larvae on the corpse could be soaked and analyzed using techniques such as gas chromatography, thin layer chromatography, mass spectrum, spectrometry, sorry. And, and now additionally, right, the toxins within the corpse, it could hinder larvae developmental stages of the specific insect. Now, for example, again, the poison or the drug, it could either speed up, slow down, or completely stop the insect from growing. And obviously, the insect can end up dying. Now, for example, cocaine or heroin, they tend to accelerate the growth process of larvae in corpse. And whereas the various poisons such as melatonin, it decreases insect growth on the body. Now this in return, it could sometimes provide like a false result with the estimated time of death or the place of death or other important insect related details about the corpse. Now moving on to the next point, abuse and neglect. Now the evidence of insects, it not only gives an approximation of how long the person died, but it could also detect if a living person is being sorry about that. It could also detect if a living person is being abused or neglected. Now, for example, right, in older persons, if they're being abused, right, their wounds, they usually serve as hotspots for insects. And in addition to this, right, if there were circumstances of bad hygiene in elderly persons or even young persons, this would attract a certain type of flies, right? And sorry about that, guys. Yeah, this will attract only a certain species of flies, right? And in cases such as sexual assault, sometimes the victim, they are drugged and bound and they're usually left helpless, right? And this sometimes it will lead to urine soaked garments and so on. Now, with all of this happening, it would act as a breeding site for some different species of flies. And additionally, due to sexual assault, the blowflies, they are mostly attracted to exposed areas such as the penis, the anus, or the vagina, or so on, right? This alone, this would hint at sexual crime. Now, in the event of physical abuse, if wounds were inflicted on the person and this person end up and like die, the insects, they would colonize the wounds first and then they would move on to the other parts of the body. If the activities of maggots are away from the natural openings of the body, such as the mouth and so on, then the insects would mostly be found on like inflicted wounds, right? An example would be maggot activity within the palm of the hands. This would be like an indication of probable like a defense wound, because you know if somebody go to like chop you or something, you can mostly put up your hands and try to like block this person from chopping you. So this is one example. Now moving on to the next point, insects could also be used to determine the site of the crime. Now determine if the body was moved from its original place is an important step in a murder case, right? So knowing the distribution of insect species in a preferred geographical area or region, it is crucial when investigating the transfer of a body between geographical areas or locations. An example would be different species of flies, they would prefer a specific geographic region or an environment, right? One species that could be found in the city, it would not be found in rural areas, and vice versa. Okay, guys, so I just had blackout and it kind of cut the connection off and the recording was cut short. So you guys, you have two recordings from me. We could thank GPL for the nonsense. Anyways, the last thing I remember speaking about was using the insect data for um, determining the site of crime, right? Now I was speaking about um, oh, the species of insects which could be found in like a city, it would not be found in rural areas, vice versa. So if a species of insect that is found only in the city is obtained from a body that is found in a rural area, then common sense will tell you that somebody moved the body. Now, this would not only give an indication that the body has been moved, but it would also like give a type of hint as to what type of area the death actually occurred in. Now, in addition to this, the insects, they could also indicate if there was like a disturbance after the death, like if somebody was around the body or anything of the sort. Now, an example would be like if the suspect returned to the crime scene, he or she they could disrupt the insect life cycle, and this would not only lead to like a determination of a possible date of death, but also like the date that the suspect returned, and hence this would create a link between the victim and the suspect in some kind of way, right? Now, lastly, we will look at DNA analysis for identification of species. Now, this is fairly simple, right? Now, when estimating the age of the larvae, the identification of the correct species of the insect is important. Now, usually the comparison is based off morphology and it would require like a special expertise, which is very time consuming. However, in order to identify the species of insects in a faster way, persons came up with the polymerase chain reaction technique. And y'all, we did this, so y'all should know what I'm talking about, the PCR technique. And it is used and it basically amplifies suited regions of the larvae genomes, and a comparison is made to the reference data. And this brings us to the end of this presentation. But um I have pictures to show you guys with like the stages of decomposition in a body and how the maggots and so on infest the body. Now, I don't really want to show you guys a human body because it's really graphic and I don't know how some y'all if y'all are strong, but anyways, we can just use a pig man. So let me just show you. Okay. So this is a pig on day 1 of its death. Then we have the blowflies coming in, doing what they gotta do. The pig begins to bloat. You can see discoloration and so on. Then the maggots infest the pig. Highly decomposed, and you can see all the maggots on this pig. There's this. So yeah. And another thing, the blowflies. So this is it. Alright, so this thing taking its own time to load. So I'm sure you guys could see this is clear enough. So yeah, that's basically the end of this presentation. Thank you guys for listening.